US biolabs that worked with dangerous pathogens and viruses really did and do exist in Ukraine. The head of US National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, published data about American biolabs around the world, including in Ukraine. The US intelligence report states that such centers were allegedly located in Kharkiv, Dnipro, Lviv, Vinnytsia, Chernihiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And there, research was conducted on the pathogens responsible for anthrax, tularemia, swine flu, fever, plague, and other illnesses. Sounds scary, doesn't it? And even more so, it matches the version of Russian propaganda that the Kremlin has been promoting for many years. Essentially, Tulsi Gabbard made public information that, without detailed examination, is specifically directed against the US government. And she claims that Americans were creating dangerous biolabs in Ukraine to even develop biological weapons. But here it's necessary to carefully study the topic and closely read that very report from US National Intelligence to understand what this report actually reveals. Well, for example, if we look at the so-called evidence that Tulsi Gabbard presented to us, we'll see that even the names of Ukrainian cities are listed incorrectly, even though she calls these secret documents. Moreover, Tulsi Gabbard obviously went back to the Kremlin's playbook one last time. Why do I say this? Because she's resigning on June 30th. And previously, she repeatedly spoke out against Ukraine on Russia's side, and even claimed that it was America that was to blame for this war of Russia against Ukraine. She said that it was the Americans who provoked the Russians. But let's take a realistic look at the US intelligence report. What if the Americans really did conduct some dangerous experiments in Ukraine? And what are these laboratories anyway? My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like the video, leave any comment, and also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link is in the description of this video. So, let's figure this out in detail, but be patient in order to really understand what's going on. We will now go through this whole story in detail, step by step. First, I'll present the facts, so don't be alarmed. At first, there will be information from US National Intelligence as it was presented, and only then will we analyze it. The director of US National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has released evidence that, according to her agency, indicates long-term funding by the US government. There are more than 120 biological laboratories in over 30 countries around the world where research on biological pathogens is being conducted, some of which are dangerous. The main idea of this revelation is that the previous administration, represented by Joe Biden and the Democrats in general, invested US taxpayers' money in research in other countries. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I'll immediately, literally and fully quote the statement, which you can read yourself on the US National Intelligence website. I'm quoting, and you can follow the text on the screen to make sure there are no manipulations on my part. So, here's the quote. After several months of studying documents and intelligence community archives, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard has released new evidence of long-standing US government funding for more than 120 biolabs in over 30 countries. These biolabs include laboratories in Ukraine, which may be at risk due to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. For example, earlier the intelligence community warned that a US-funded biolab in Ukraine was likely storing dangerous pathogens and remained vulnerable to long-standing threats of attack, seizure, or damage by Russia. Until now, evidence of the existence and funding of these laboratories has been deliberately hidden from the American people. Information about the existence, history, location, and funding of these US-funded biolabs was deliberately concealed by influential people who falsely claimed they did not exist and accused anyone who said otherwise of being foreign agents and traitors to America. Many of these US government-funded biolabs are currently or were previously engaged in research using dangerous and highly contagious pathogens, in some cases including risky gain-of-function research on pathogens, with almost no control or oversight. Here, excuse me, I'll pause and point that out right away. The National Intelligence Report talks about dangerous gain-of-function research on pathogens. Remember this point, we'll come back to it later. I'll continue the quote. President Trump understands the serious threat that dangerous gain-of-function research poses to the American people. That's why, on May 25, 2025, he took decisive action by signing Executive Order number 14,292, ending federal funding for gain-of-function research worldwide. Again, remember this wording and definition of pathogen gain-of-function. And then, on the US National Intelligence website, there's a quote from Tulsi Gabbard. Despite the obvious potential for catastrophic global consequences that research on dangerous pathogens in biological laboratories may have, politicians, so-called medical workers like Dr. Fauci, and members of the national security team in Joe Biden's administration lied to the American people about the existence of US-funded and supported biological laboratories and threatened those who tried to reveal the truth. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence will continue to work closely with partners across the government to determine where these laboratories are located, what pathogens they contain, and put an end to dangerous gain-of-function research that threatens the health and well-being of the American people and people around the world. And then, further on the US National Intelligence website, it says, Director of National Intelligence Gabbard has issued new directives for the intelligence community, instructing them to expand the collection of information about these laboratories and facilities abroad. This directive already provides new details about the clinical trials conducted in these facilities, which raises serious ethical, financial, and security concerns regarding these alleged public health and national security initiatives. There you go. In addition to this statement, the US National Intelligence website provides 4 pages of a document indicating that such laboratories existed in 30 countries. But Tulsi Gabbard specifically singled out Ukraine. And this is where things get really interesting. The documents clearly show that the Director of National Intelligence approved the public release of these documents back on April 23, but remained silent. And here is this unusual step. Tulsi Gabbard took this step just a few days before she left her post as Director of National Intelligence, who, I should note, heads the intergovernmental office created to coordinate information sharing among the sprawling US intelligence community. And at first, it wasn't clear why Gabbard made this information public. And it's still not really clear why she did it. Now let's talk about what these laboratories actually were, and whether they were really secret. To get ahead of myself, I'll say this. The laboratories did exist, but they were never secret. The fact is, for many years, under the so-called Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the US government really did fund efforts to secure research programs from the Cold War era, mostly related to Soviet programs for developing biological and chemical weapons technologies. To put it simply, the Americans funded the program in order to keep under control those programs that the Soviet Union developed during the Cold War. And so, where were some of the remaining Soviet facilities located? In Kyiv, in Tbilisi, which is also well known, and in other places on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And here's an interesting point for you. The fact is that the Trump administration did indeed ban spending American money on such research to modify organisms to enhance their biological functions in countries like China in May. How do you like that? So yes, Americans did fund certain biolabs in China. But Tulsi Gabbard stays quiet about China, saying it happened in Ukraine. Yes, and it's no secret that such US government agencies as the Department of Defense have long been funding foreign laboratories that conduct research in the field of diseases. There's nothing top secret about it. Now let's get back to Tulsi Gabbard and her statement that it's all Joe Biden's fault. Russia has long been exploiting claims that biological laboratories were being used to create biological weapons. So, don't be surprised by their propaganda about combat mosquitoes or about some kinds of viruses being developed there that would only affect Russians. So, nothing will happen to Ukrainians, but a Russian will get sick right away. It sounds so ridiculous in the context of how many people there are in Russia. How many people live in Russia? How many ethnic groups live in Russia? How could you create a genetic module that would only work on a Russian but not on a Buryat? What about a resident of Tatarstan or, for example, the ethnic groups of the Caucasus? Will it work on them or not? Will it work on Chechens? How is that supposed to work? And these accusations have fueled persistent conspiracy theories for many years, some of which the US government has repeatedly tried to refute. And for example, in 2023, the US State Department accused Moscow of, quote, increasing the volume and intensity of disinformation about biological weapons. In an unsuccessful attempt to divert attention from the invasion of Ukraine, reduce international support for Ukraine, and justify its unjustified war. If you look at the documents that Tulsi Gabbard is revealing to us, you will see that they clearly state that this is a completely legitimate American program. And then something curious and amusing happened with Tulsi Gabbard. When Tulsi Gabbard tried to play along with Russian propaganda by talking about some secret laboratories in Ukraine, she herself suddenly showed some rather strange documents. Tulsi Gabbard's office, in the slides with these so-called proofs about Biolabs, mistakenly indicated the location of Kyiv, for example, placing it closer to the south of Ukraine. Apparently they think Kyiv is close to Odessa. In addition, there is a city called Cherniv on this map. What kind of city is that? I have no idea. Chernihiv, Cherkasy, what city is that? There you go. In addition, Gabbard's slides indicate that such laboratories existed in Luhansk and Donetsk. What do you think about that? And let me remind you, the Russians captured the Ukrainian cities of Donetsk and Luhansk a long time ago, unfortunately, but they still haven't shown these scary laboratories. The question is, why? And now the most important thing. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Tulsi Gabbard stated that it was the United States of America that was to blame for Russian aggression because, according to her, they provoked the Russians for many years. And I quote, "The ruling elite in Washington is using Ukrainians to destroy as many Russians as possible." What do you think of this theory? So she's saying the Americans provoked the Russians so that the Russians, these wild creatures, would attack the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians would destroy as many Russians as possible. And this was the cunning plan of the Americans. In addition, Tulsi Gabbard spread disinformation about the development of weapons of mass destruction in Ukrainian biolabs. So, are there actually such laboratories in Ukraine? Friends, yes, there are. There are dozens of laboratories operating in Ukraine that work exclusively for detection and identification of infectious disease agents and fall under the scope of international health regulations. And yes, these laboratories really do work with dangerous viruses, and here's a shock for you. Yes, some of these laboratories really do receive financial and other support from the United States of America, from the European Union, and from the World Health Organization, just like it happens in many other countries around the world. Moreover, if you go to the website of the American Embassy in Kyiv, you will find publicly available information that the US provides funding for the work of these laboratories. Once again, no one is hiding this. In addition, in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States of America started a program to reduce biological threats in order to lower the risks associated with biological weapons, which remained in countries like Ukraine and Georgia as a legacy from the Soviet Union. Surprising, isn't it? And yes, the website of the US Embassy in Kyiv openly states that the US provides technical support. And according to the US Embassy in Ukraine, quote, they work with foreign partners to counter the threat of outbreaks of dangerous infections and diseases around the world. That's the kind of disclosure of some supposedly super secret information from Tulsi Gabbard. That's why I urge you to always think critically, and before reacting to sensational headlines, it's worth reading a bit more information, at least a paragraph after the headline. I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and be sure to like this episode. And, friends, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link is in the description. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves, keep your critical thinking sharp, and see you next time.